Good evening. Welcome to our program on recent research on the Underground Railroad in eastern Iowa. Presentation by Douglas W. Jones. Doug is an archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Office, State Historical Society of Iowa. And I know there's more to the title, but Doug, we're going to let it go at that. Doug has served as an archaeological advisor and historical researcher on the Iowa Freedom Trail Project, documenting people, places, and events associated with abolitionist and Underground Railroad activities in Iowa. Historically, those activities were better known and documented in Cedar, Johnson, and Clinton counties. However, in this program, Doug will tell about activities in adjacent counties, including Muscatine County. We're delighted to welcome you to the Muscatine. I see as of tonight, this place is called the Muscatine Center for Nonprofits. I get that right? Let's recognize Tom Huber, who suggested trying to have a public program in here. He's sitting all the way in the back, and it's an experiment. I think it's working. Thank you, Tom.
Welcome, everybody.
So I give you Doug Jones.
All right. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's we've been talking about doing a program here in Muscatine for many years, and it's good to finally be here and be able to give you some brand new information that we found. I will apologize. Unfortunately, my other duties as assigned have been keeping me very busy, and I haven't been able to do much research, the fun stuff here. So there's some things that I was hoping to have done for this presentation that I'm not quite ready yet to unveil, but I think we're going to have a fun program here, and hopefully we'll give you some things to think about and some things to perhaps do some further research on. When we're talking about the Underground Railroad in Iowa, we're talking about primarily the story of African Americans who were in slavery seeking their freedom. That's the primary part of this story. And it's the part of the story that we've actually had the most problems researching. It's been very hard to track what happened with some of the freedom seekers as they were coming into Iowa, as they were going out of Iowa up to Canada or to Chicago or to Michigan. Some of the freedom seekers went to Canada, Chicago, and then came back to Iowa. And we have some information on them. And particularly when we're talking about the freedom seekers, this is the new term that the Park Service has put in instead of runaway slaves. These are people that are seeking their freedom. They want out of slavery, they want their opportunities, they want their freedom. So we are now using the term freedom seeker, which is more appropriate. And actually I'm giving you some examples of different people, and actually my examples are all from Cedar County. This is Thomas Jenkins, who was a freedom seeker, arrived in Springdale, Iowa, over in Cedar County. When he arrived there, he was in very bad shape, and they nursed him back to health. He went off to Canada, and then he eventually came back and lived the rest of his life in Springdale, Iowa, with the Friends or the Quakers there at Springdale. And Thomas Jenkins is one of my favorite people because when he came back into the community, every year he was in the schools there locally teaching. He would be there with his little dog, his little terrier dog named Dinah. And they would go in and teach the kids in the late 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s what life as a slave on a farm or plantation was like. Something very unique. We're also talking about the people that were helping the freedom seekers find their way to freedom. And these people would be known as conductors or agents. And I'm going to use William Maxon as an example for this and also the other categories, because he actually met all the categories, basically. I love William Maxon. He was up at Springdale. He was not a Quaker. And here's one of the stories that he was involved with, where he actually took a number of freedom seekers and disguised them in sacks of potatoes and got to the train station. And we think this was it had to be either West Liberty or Mechanicsville. Got to the train station, and one of the sacks of potatoes sneezed. bit of an issue. But the station agent overlooked it, and hopefully they found their way to freedom. Here's William Maxon's house. This is no longer with us. It is gone. It's an archaeological site at this point. And when we refer to Underground Railroad stations, these are the places where the freedom seekers were coming to and finding shelter. Now, one thing to keep in mind, when we're talking about this story, it's the 1840s, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and early 1860s. Most of Iowa was log cabins and some early frame houses, and you didn't really have substantial houses like you had out east. And, you know, we've all seen the stories out east where they've got all these hiding places in the houses. Out here, that wasn't really the story. A lot of times the freedom seekers would not be in the houses. They were at William Maxon's. There was a basement, and there was plenty of room in there that supposedly they could get maybe 12 to 13 people in the basement at one time. But it's more common that as the freedom seekers were coming to these places, they would be out in fields, they would be out in the woodlots, they would be out in the prairie, they would be at, a lot of these folks that were involved with the abolitionists and Underground Railroad activities were from the Northeast, and they were involved in milling operations. So a lot of times you would have people down at the mill under the guise that they were employed to do the milling work. So a lot of times the people were not actually in the houses, although with William Maxon at Springdale, they were. And then what we call the station master, the people that were basically hosting the freedom seekers as they were coming through. William Maxon, his house was that type of arrangement, and also William Maxon is well known too because not only were freedom seekers coming through here, but also John Brown was a good friend of William Maxon's, and while John Brown rarely stayed at William Maxon's place, many times whoever was traveling with John Brown would stay with William Maxon and his wife. So those are the basic terms for the story, the Underground Railroad activities in Iowa. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about our project and what we've been doing. Our project began in 2002. We got a grant from the Federal Highway Administration to basically document the people, places, and the events associated with the Underground Railroad activities in Iowa. Lowell Soike, who was my boss at the time, was the project director, and John Zeller served as the primary historian for the project, and then I eventually got involved with this project too. Going into this project, we were hoping that more of the places where the freedom seekers were at and the conductors, their houses, we were hoping more of those places were still in existence. We found out they really aren't. Most of these places are gone. There's very few places left where this story was part of that place and part of the history of those people that were there. So that's how I basically got involved in this. It quickly turned to an archaeological investigation in some regards at different places. We've been spending our time going around the state and working with the few places that are still in existence that actually have open museums, and these are places that you can actually go experience the history of what happened there. This is at the basement of the James Jordan House in West Des Moines. This was the house. The current house probably was not an Underground Railroad stop. James Jordan's earlier cabin probably was the Underground Railroad stop, but nonetheless, they're using the current house, which is an amazing house. It's listed on the National Register, as interpretation of the time period and interpreting the Underground Railroad story here in Iowa. And quickly, the few places that are here in Iowa to go to would be the Llewellyn House down at Salem, Iowa, down in Henry County, the John Todd House out in Tabor, Iowa, which is it's in very far southwest Iowa on the border of Mills and Fremont County. Also the George Hitchcock House at Lewis, Iowa. The James Jordan House. The African American Museum in Cedar Rapids has got a very good exhibit to go look at. Also, as many of you probably are aware, the rest stop out here on Interstate 80 on the eastbound was done in an Underground Railroad theme. Now, I will say we have a few issues with what they did out there, but nonetheless, they did a whole rest stop with the Underground Railroad theme, and there's actually a lot of information from Cedar County that has been incorporated into that rest stop. One of the things we're trying to do is publish a book about the results of what we found. Lowell Soike is about ready to retire in a little over a month, and he has a 600-page manuscript that he's going to be turning into the University of Iowa to see whether they're going to publish it or not. And hopefully that will be coming out eventually, probably if everything goes well, next year. We've also been working on the few places that are still with us. We've been working on updating their National Register nominations, and in some cases, and this is the George Hitchcock House, we actually prepared a nomination to get it designated as a National Historic Landmark. And here's a nice picture of the Friends of the Hitchcock House and myself and a number of other folks from the Park Service with the Network to Freedom, which is based out of the Midwest region in Omaha. We're also trying to establish a website to put out current research and events such as this speaking event tonight out on an internet website. Unfortunately, we're having some technical difficulties. Some of the people want some money to do those things, and money is kind of tight right now. And another thing that we're hoping to do eventually, some of our researchers went through basically all the available newspapers from the 1830s through the 1860s. We have, I wouldn't even want to have, maybe 50,000 articles relating to this Underground Railroad events in Iowa. And we're hoping that we could put those up on the internet so people could do research on that. And unfortunately, we haven't found a way to do that. Here's an example. This is just all these different newspaper clippings, and they're from all over the United States. It's not just here in Iowa. They're from New York, Chicago, St. Louis. This is all about one story, and perhaps you might recognize this story. This is the story of Celia and Eliza Grayson. This is one of Oprah's favorite stories. These two young ladies escaped from their master in Nebraska City, and with some help made it all the way across Iowa, made it into Chicago, and then there's some differing stories about what happened in Chicago, but these newspaper clippings are all about that story as they were going across the state. And they weren't, Celia and Eliza actually stayed in many stops in Cedar County and in Clinton County, so they weren't that far away. We're also working with some of the places that are still in existence. Some of these places need some tender loving care, so we've been out with the Park Service trying to make some recommendations and trying to get them some information on different types of grants that they could apply for to help preserve these places. This is the basement of the John Todd House in Tabor, Iowa. We're also trying to develop a traveling guide and brochure for different Underground Railroad sites in Iowa. That's in progress right now. This is one of the few things that is actually pretty much done. We have put up a series of markers across the state where John Brown and his party came through on the last trip through Iowa in the winter and spring of 1859. They entered the state in probably December 1858, and then were here for about 3 months, and then headed to the east and eventually off to Harper's Ferry. And hopefully, within the next 2 months, you are going to be able to go to the State Historical Society website, and you ought to be able to pull up the signs themselves and the locations where they're at in the state. And it actually very closely follows Interstate 80 for a good chunk of the way. We do have at least one marker at the Grinnell eastbound rest stop that, oddly enough, there were 2 Underground Railroad stations very close to 2 of the interstate rest stops. So we've taken advantage of that and we put some information there. And I guess let me go back to this too. There are, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later because one of the signs is right here in Muscatine County at West Liberty. And there are 3 other signs that are very close. There's one in Iowa City. There's one at the Springdale Friends Cemetery, and there will be one going up in downtown Davenport on the seawall. This is an outdated map, but this is still pretty good as far as what we think we know about the Underground Railroad story in Iowa. And you can see it's a network, and you can see there are also places here where we literally found nothing. Does anybody, I will just open this up for a guess. Does anybody know why we have some big blank spots here in southern Iowa? It's because those areas were heavily settled by people from the south who had different ideas about slavery and what was acceptable and what was not. And so those areas were largely avoided because they were problem areas. Now, this actually reflects more of what the current status of our research. I updated this for last year, and there really hasn't been a lot to add, with the exception of what we're going to talk about tonight. There is some activity in this area that we need to further map, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. The main route, I probably should say this too, the main route, and the one that was consistently used, was one that there were different ways that you could get into Iowa City. Iowa City was a very different place at that time. It was very dangerous for freedom seekers to be in Iowa City for very long. And they didn't stay there very long. They were usually hustled out to West Branch and Springdale and PD, which was, PD was a small town out there around Springdale, or maybe more of a rural community. And from there, they either went north up to Dubuque, well, up into northwest Cedar County, and then either into Lynn County, eastern Lynn County, or western Jones County, and then eventually up to Dubuque. And then there was this main route here that went from this area up to Tipton, over to the eastern border of Cedar County, and then basically through a little bit of Scott County, and then over to Clinton. And there's also another route that we're going to talk about that came in from the south, and actually Muscatine is part of that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get back to Muscatine. Now, one of the things that we found out with the research, some of the places have known about the story for a long, long time. There are many descendants that are still in the communities that, from the people that were involved with these activities. And take, for instance, Cedar County. I've spent a lot of time in Cedar County doing research. We have 2 bankers' boxes full of information on Cedar County alone. Most of the counties, we have maybe 3 inches. Cedar County, we have over a yard of information. And Cedar County, if you look at some of the county histories, at least one of the county histories has 2 full chapters on John Brown and on Underground Railroad activities. Also, you have people like Mildred Ewell Phelps, who not only did Mildred Ewell Phelps actually live in the Maxon home at a later date, but her father was an Underground Railroad conductor in northwest Cedar County. So you have basically people with firsthand knowledge about these people and what they were doing at that time for the conductors. And I will say too, most of this story has focused on the conductors because that's been the easier information to get at. Once again, the freedom seekers, we have some information, but not much. You also, Cedar County, if you haven't had a chance, there was a wonderful exhibit that was pulled together by two young ladies who were in the Museum Studies program at the University of Iowa. This was debuted last year at Herbert Hoover for the statewide Underground Railroad Conference. And this is at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Welcome Center. It's off of display this month, but it will be back in about a month or so. And it's a very good exhibit. There's about 8 or 9 panels of information. Just to give you an idea, the last Cedar County talk I did went for, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that. There's that much information to talk about in Cedar County. One of the things that I enjoy about this research is you get to meet and learn about some really interesting people. This is Robert Lee Smith. He lived around DeWitt, Iowa. He was a second cousin to Robert E. Lee. He legally tried to get rid of Lee out of his name, but apparently it cost too much or whatever. He didn't do it. But he was a very fiery abolitionist, and he was an Underground Railroad conductor. And this is what's actually on his tombstone, and it's a bit hard to read, so I will do my best here to translate. Born in Butler County, Pennsylvania, February 19th, 1813. Died at DeWitt, Iowa, May 9th, 1882, aged 72 years, 2 months, 20 days. Was son of Joseph and Martha Smith of Scotch descent. And was migrated to DeWitt, Iowa in 1848. In early life, he united with the ME Church, separating from it on all of its positions on the question of African slavery. He united with the Wesleyan Methodist Church. Afterward, joined the Free Methodist Church at DeWitt. Was always an abolitionist and advocated freedom both in Pennsylvania and Iowa. He assisted runaway slaves on their way to Canada. Also opposed Freemasonry and all secret societies. Was a man of firm convictions, uncompromising when convinced he was right. Lived respected by all, died by all, beloved, and surrounded by his children. So now, how many descriptions have you seen on tombstones like this? Not many. This is a person that felt very deeply on what he believed, that it was right, and he was going to do them no matter what the law said or no matter what anybody was going to try to do to him or his family. Celie and Eliza Grayson stayed at his house for about a week before there's a terrific story about them going across the ice on the Mississippi River. Then you also have folks like Lori Tatum, stodgy old Quaker friend up at Springdale. He's probably better well known because when Herbert Hoover was orphaned, he was the guardian of the Hoover children. And he also did a number of things, but one of the things that is quite unusual, he was an Underground Railroad conductor, and he also was a station agent. And not very many people wrote about what they did. Lori did. Now this was well after the fact, but nonetheless, he still basically laid out what he did, and we have a whole story. And actually this story was found by the two young ladies that did the research for the exhibit up at Cedar County. We had totally overlooked it. We had not found it in our research, and they were like, hey, look at this. That's the really fun thing about doing Underground Railroad research. You never know what you're going to find and what it's going to tell you. And we're going to talk about that some more, too. And you can also see, too, here, Lori Tatum also talks about John Brown in the Springdale community before he left. So it's not often that you actually get handwritten letters basically depicting, what not only they did, but also things going on in the community at that time. course, this is well after the fact, but nonetheless, you rarely see this. And actually, here's what I've been doing with that story that Lori Tatum wrote. Talks about freedom seekers. We think they probably came in through this route through Iowa City, over to West Branch, Springdale. They went up to cross here at Gower's Ferry, I believe, and then wound up at Pete's Mill, and then they wound up here at the Hopewell Friends Settlement in eastern Lynn County. This Hopewell Friends Settlement disbanded very early, and so there's really nothing left up there but a very small cemetery that's in the yard of a house. It's not all that easy to find. And then we assume they probably went up to Dubuque from there. So with the stories that we are getting, we are starting to do this so that we can give people an idea where they were going. Now, going back to this, here's what we think we have found so far, with the exception, there's some new things that I need to add in here. And particularly, we'll talk about Atalissa in a little bit. This black dot means that there were abolitionists there, but we really didn't have any stories. That now is a red dot, and we'll show you why. But we're going to start off with giving you just a little bit of information. You can't just start in Muscatine County without talking a little bit about what was going on in some of the other counties. And since one of the main routes coming into this area was through Iowa City, we're going to tell you a little bit about the folks in Johnson County. Unfortunately, for the southern route, I don't have all the research done for that. The route that goes through Washington and Crawfordsville and then Columbus City and then up to Muscatine. I can tell you a few people that were involved with that route, but I don't know much about what they were doing, and I haven't got that totally sorted out yet. But we do know with this route, we do know that William Penn Clark and Dr. Jesse Bowen were actively involved with the story, and they were also actively involved with John Brown. Jesse Bowen was a doctor. He was actually at the time also the adjutant after the Harper's Ferry raid and in the Civil War, he was the adjutant general for Iowa, and he was involved with a number of different things. He was a very staunch abolitionist. He was also, as with a lot of these people that were abolitionists, they were also temperance people. They were anti-alcohol. They were involved with different things. A lot of these folks were Congregationalists and Friends or Quakers. There were other denominations involved with these activities. Sometimes you had some Wesleyan Methodists. Sometimes you had a few Baptists. But by far and large, most of the people involved doing the conducting and hosting the Freedom Seekers were Congregationalists or Friends. Here's Jesse Bowen's house. This house is where John Brown and John Kagi, when they went into Iowa City on their last trip, this is the house they actually stayed in. This was on Iowa Avenue. It's no longer around, but one of the sign that's up in Iowa City is very close to where this house was at. This is part of the stop where they actually went into Iowa City. They were having a conference in Iowa City and making some arrangements. And it also turned out that there was an armed mob. The Postal Service representative, Sam Workman, had organized the armed mob to try to arrest John Brown and the rest of his party, and it didn't quite work out too well. They managed to get out of Iowa City, and we know the rest of the story. Now, associated with Jesse Bowen was William Penn Clark. William Penn Clark is probably one of the most important people in Iowa history that nobody knows about. He was involved with many, many different things. He was involved with the formation of the Republican Party, not only here in Iowa, but nationally. He originally came to Iowa in 1844, and he studied law, but he also did a number of other things, and you can see some of the things he later did in life. But William Penn Clark was a very staunch abolitionist, and he also became an editor of a newspaper, and he wrote a lot of different things. And unfortunately, we have not found much of his writings yet. We're still searching for some of his editorials and different things that he had to say. But he was very vocal about the whole issue of slavery. And he served as the Iowa State-Kansas Committee chairman. And what this was he was helping set up the Jim Lane Trail. And the trail started at Iowa City because that's where the railroad line stopped at that point for those years. And so they were shipping people and supplies out to Kansas because you couldn't go through Missouri. Missouri closed their borders to the people that were going out to settle Kansas who were abolitionists. You could not go through Missouri safely to get there. And so all these people were funneling up into southern Iowa, and particularly Iowa City, and then later Mount Pleasant. And they were going on this Jim Lane Trail that goes all the way across the state and then eventually goes through southeast Nebraska and then down into Kansas. That's the main supply line. And William Penn Clark was one of the masterminds of keeping the bodies and the supplies flowing back and forth on that trail through Iowa. Now, here's a very telling example. Not everybody appreciated what William Penn Clark and some of these other abolitionists and Underground Railroad folks were doing. And so here's an example of a news article where somebody is basically calling out some very prominent people. The one thing that you need to understand about this story, these Underground Railroad conductors, they were not nobodies in the community. These were some of the most prominent, wealthy citizens in the communities. You got Josiah Grinnell at Grinnell College. He was involved. You got William Penn Clark named. You got Dr. Bowen named. And you got, Bixby, Amos Bixby, who was also involved with the political scene. And they're being specifically named and called out for what they're doing. Everybody had a chance to read that? Now, William Penn Clark is also a good segue into Muscatine County, because William Penn Clark may be more well known for what he did in helping John Brown get out of Iowa on the last trip. William Penn Clark, along with Josiah Grinnell, arranged for a boxcar to be delivered at West Liberty at the depot. And that's what John Brown and his party, he had 12 freedom seekers, and he had 13 or 14 men, and they pretty much all loaded up into this boxcar that was on a sidetrack. And the only two people that did not load up into the boxcar was, one was John Kagi, who was John Brown's right-hand man, and William Penn Clark boarded with John Kagi. They were up in one of the coaches because there were a couple of suspicious people that had gotten on the train, and they were concerned that the U.S. Marshals were going to be in Davenport waiting to arrest their party. And so William Penn Clark and John Kagi were up in the coach, made it to Davenport without any incidents. They got to Davenport. The U.S. Marshals did search the train, did not find the party. William Penn Clark got off the train. He checked into an adjacent hotel, got into his hotel room, looked out the window, and watched the train go across the bridge to Illinois. And that's the end of the story for the John Brown trip in Iowa. But and supposedly William Penn Clark actually has written an article about this whole story, which unfortunately we've not been able to track down. We're still looking for it. We're anxious to see what he actually wrote in that article. And here's the current the former West Liberty Depot. This is not where John Brown entered the boxcar. This is not very far away from where that depot at that time was at. And last year, right before the start of the statewide Underground Railroad Conference at West Branch, we actually installed one of our signs, and here is Lowell Soike and Kent Sissel and Dan Clark and Conrad Gregg helping install the sign. And here's the sign, and I'm sorry, the sign kind of bleached out. There's two different sizes of signs. There's smaller ones like this, and then there are big ones. Some of the big ones are at the Springdale French Cemetery, the James Jordan House, in the areas where there was more information available about the story and about the people that were involved. And you can go see this. This is open to the public. You can go there anytime you want. Now, this is a good segue to go into what we found about Muscatine County. And we're going to start off in West Liberty. And one of the things, we haven't really found much information for West Liberty. We know A.F. Keith actually owned a milling operation, and he actually helped with the John Brown departure from Iowa. He was also involved with the boxcar and maneuvering people, and supposedly, according to some of the accounts, they had a big party for John Brown and his contingent before they left. It was the night before they rolled into West Liberty, they had a big party, and they left the next day. So, now whether that happened or not, we don't know for a fact. Jonathan Maxon is actually the son of William Maxon, one of the sons of William Maxon. He moves to West Liberty in 1864 and is the postmaster. We don't know whether he was doing Underground Railroad activities or not. Once he got to West Liberty, we know he probably was involved with things at Springdale. We can't prove that for a fact. We know two of his other brothers definitely were. And actually, two of the Maxon brothers were on their way to Harper's Ferry and did not get there when before it happened, and they turned around and came back. We also have this AC, and I'm not sure how to pronounce this, whether it's choir or queer or how to pronounce that. We have no idea who these people are, but they were identified by a gentleman that I'm going to talk about here a bit more, this J.A. Jelly. He wrote a letter to Wilbur H. Siebert, who was collecting information about Underground Railroad activities across the United States. And J.A. Jelly identified these two individuals as knowing more about what was going on in the communities. So we don't really know what they were involved with or what they knew. We're still looking at them. And Joseph Gibson, he was a friend, a Quaker, and John Brown stopped at his house. We're not sure whether they stayed overnight or whether it was just a visit. The account is not very long and not very detailed, so it's really hard to say how involved he was. One thing, too, to take note, this was also the sign installation. This is the John Brown sword. This sword was given to the Maxon family by John Brown and his party. And Jonathan Maxon was, I forget, was this the Masons?
Yeah, they called him the Tiber.
The what?
They called him the Tiber, some kind of officer in the Masonic Lodge.
Right, thank you.
Supposed to have a ceremonial sword, but they said he didn't need the ceremonial sword because he brought his own.
Right. So there's the John Brown sword there, and you will see this often. It's actually on display quite a bit at various times. Now, what was even more interesting in our research, there was a whole African American community at West Liberty. There were at least, let's see, how many families do we have here? I think 8 now that were living in the West Liberty area. Now, we don't know how early they were there. We don't know how long they were there. There are some stories about different things that happened, and particularly Henry Kelly. There is a story that Henry Kelly was actually murdered by his son-in-law, and that was big news in West Liberty. And Dick and Hannah Anderson were probably the best well-known out of all these families, as Dick Anderson organized the possum dinners and the social events in West Liberty, and apparently was a very social individual, made the rounds. There's a couple of different stories available for Dick Anderson. Now, the one thing that we do know is that at least 5 of these families all lived in what they called the tenement house in West Liberty. And apparently this was located where Gibson's sale barn was. We still haven't totally pinned that down. We're probably going to get with Conrad Gregg, who's one of the local historians, a longtime resident in West Liberty, and hopefully we will get that pinned down. The other thing to note is that, let's see, at least 3 of these families, it was noted that both the husband and wife were both former slaves. And I thought that was rather interesting that that was actually noted that way. So I'm hoping that that means that perhaps maybe they came there as freedom seekers, and that there had to have been something going on at West Liberty. So it's going to take some further research, but I really think there's probably something there and more to the story when you're seeing 8 families in that community. Now here's another thing that showed up of interest. In the Centennial Parade for West Liberty, the most comical float was done by the Fortnightly Club, which is a women's literary club, and it was basically an old wagon, buckboard wagon, that was depicting the Underground Railroad. And I find that interesting, not because it was the most comical float, but that here's a town that we really don't have much information on Underground Railroad activities, but yet it's still in the legend and lore of the community, how important these things were in that community. And we're seeing this in a couple of other communities, particularly down at Denmark, Iowa. For their 100th anniversary, they actually had an Underground Railroad play. And Denmark, Iowa was a congregational town. And so you're seeing these celebrations in these towns that this was an important part of their story too. So I find that very interesting. And actually, if anybody has a picture of that float, I would like to see it. Okay, we're going to move on over to Atalissa and vicinity. Atalissa and vicinity, for many, many years, has been a great puzzle. We've had several names, and we never have been able to put the pieces together until recently. And this J.A. Jelly, actually, we talked about him a bit ago, he actually lived at Atalissa, or outside of Atalissa. And in this letter that he wrote to Wilbur H. Siebert is a story of a freedom seeker that arrived to Dr. Van Pelt's farm near Atalissa. He stayed out in the cornfield for 6 weeks, and food was carried to him by in this account it says a free Negro. In actuality, we know, and I don't know why they didn't put this in this writing, but in J.A. Jelly's letter, they actually named the person that was taking food to this gentleman. His name was William Greening, and he was from Muscatine. And this went on, and the bounty hunters eventually found out where he was at, came to the front door and said, you know, have you seen this individual? And Mrs. Van Pelt met the bounty hunters at the door and basically said, you know, well, if I had seen any of these people, I wouldn't tell you anyway. So go away. And so they posted their $1,500 reward notice on the gate. They left, and it is noted that, and it doesn't really say who took him, but basically this gentleman was taken to Rock Island. And we're not sure whether that meant through Muscatine or through Davenport, but he went to Rock Island. We do know that. So here is a really good story for Muscatine County. It's probably one of the better ones for stories here. And I will say, let's go back a minute. Out of this whole list of, a lot of these people, as you can see, were people that had, that J.A. Jelly indicated were people that probably knew a lot more about what was going on, and that hopefully some of these people would write to him. The only other person that wrote to Wilbur Siebert was Charles Cope. And Charles Cope's letter is very interesting too, in the fact that he indicated that James Moore had assisted a number of freedom seekers, including one by the name of Bolivan Needham. And that Bolivan had gone to Canada and had become a successful businessman and were trying to find information. Supposedly, James Moore and Charles Cope, and particularly Charles Cope's family, had a number of letters from Bolivan Needham, who had written back and was in constant correspondence with that family. we're looking for those letters, and we're still looking for Baldwin Needham. We haven't found him up in Canada yet, but that's one of the neat stories. There was a lot going on. The other interesting thing, and I didn't have time to get this put together, but J.A. Jelly, for many, many years, we didn't really give J.A. Jelly much credence because we never knew who he was. Turns out, J.A. Jelly was a next-door neighbor to Dr. Van Pelt. And William Lundy, who actually is mentioned in at least one account from Cedar County, he was a next-door neighbor to J.A. Jelly and Dr. Van Pelt as well. So you have a whole enclave of folks that probably were doing things. Some of these people were definitely friends. Some of the other people I'm not really sure about. But it's interesting when you look at the bigger picture here, and we have to go up into Cedar County to look at the bigger picture. You have Atalissa here, you have the whole Springdale PD area up here, and look at all the people that were involved that we know. And actually this list is small. As Ann Kopic Rayleigh said in one of the things that she wrote, many of her neighbors were more than glad to be involved with helping people out. This is probably a very short list of all the people that were living in that area and were doing things. So you have this whole area. Here's West Liberty, here's Atalissa, and so you've got West Branch, Springdale PD. You've got a big concentration of a support group there of people that were willing to do things at the drop of a hat. And then when we look at Springdale, here was one of the Friends meetings houses at Springdale. Springdale was primarily a Quaker town. Here's actually 1908 streetscape. This was collected by a man by the name of Villard, and these photos are at, I believe, Harvard. I think it is Harvard. That he collected a bunch of these early photos, including this one, of the Joseph and Ann Kopic Rayleigh farmstead near Springdale, and you may recognize the name of the Kopics because Barclay Kopic and Edwin Kopic went out to Harper's Ferry. They were sons of Ann Kopic, and Barclay got away from Harper's Ferry. Edwin did not. Edwin was hung with John Brown and several other members of that party. And Barclay Kopic was in a story in its own right. He actually managed to escape, came back to Iowa. There was a whole series of events that happened here in Iowa, starting at Davenport and then going up into Cedar County with basically bounty hunters from Virginia trying to arrest him. And eventually, Governor Kirkwood refuses to sign the extradition papers to extradite Barclay back to Virginia. And at the same time, two other gentlemen from Ohio who had escaped the Harper's Ferry raid, the Ohio governor did the same. Lord Acton, who's a historian that is in Iowa and Great Britain at various different times, he concluded that the acts of both Governor Kirkwood here in Iowa and the governor in Ohio actually helped infuriate and inflame the whole situation and actually led South Carolina to basically start the whole Civil War and secede. And so here's a rare instance where Iowa is right in the middle of a national event and eventually a national crisis. Barclay Kopic survived all that, enlisted eventually, well, he went up to Canada to hide out for a bit, came back, he enlisted in the 10th Kansas Unit and was killed in a terrorist train wreck in northwestern Missouri. And so he didn't get to go fight in the Civil War. But oddly enough, another of the Kopic brothers who you never hear talked about, Joseph Kopic, he was the leader of an African-American infantry unit in the Civil War. William Maxon House, we've already seen pictures of this. This house is gone. This house was a national treasure. It was also famous because it was also the first grout house in Iowa. Basically, and I know our architectural historians on our staff get on me, but I keep calling it cement. That's not the correct term, I know. But anyway, if you go out to the Maxon house at this point, there's a very large granite boulder with this marker that was put on, boulder by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And I don't have any slides in this presentation. We've been actually doing a lot of work. There's a very small cemetery that's in this area, not very far away from the Maxon farmstead. And the local oral history of the community said that there were 17 freedom seekers that came into the community and had died on different trips, and they're buried in unmarked graves in the west end of the cemetery. And we were out there with the National Park Service 2-3 years ago, and we basically think that there probably is information to suggest that is true. We need to do some further research, but we do think that that is probably true. We also look a little bit further off to the east. You had a number of people in the Rochester vicinity, which is also very close. The William Green House, which actually is still up, it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was badly damaged, as far as we know, in the floods of 2008, but we believe that they are restoring it. Is that true? Yes, it is. Okay. I'm glad to hear that.
I think you got it pretty well done.
Good. I'm really glad to hear that. John Casebeer. John Casebeer was an interesting man. He called his farm Fort Sumter. He was a very fiery abolitionist. His father-in-law was Aaron Humphrey, who I'm going to talk about in a bit more in a few minutes. He and his wife were charter members of the Congregational Church at Tipton. That church was under a lot of fire locally in Tipton because they were also known as the Woolly Church because they had African Americans in their congregation. And they didn't, they basically said, everybody is welcome in this church. We don't care. And there's some really good stories of Jonathan Casebeer on some of his adventures taking people from his place and people from his father-in-law's place at Tipton over to eastern Cedar County. And then Tipton. We had a whole slug of people in Tipton. These were primarily Congregationalists, but there were some other people involved. And there's some pretty famous names for some of the history buffs among us. Judge William P. Wolfe was a legendary man in his own right. He did so many different things. Aaron Humphrey was probably one of the more interesting people in the fact that it turns out he was a second cousin to John Brown. Another person that's kind of interesting on this list is Benjamin L. Boynton. He was involved with the Tipton Union School, which I'm going to show you a picture of here in a minute. But he also made the bricks for the first Cedar County courthouse. His wife was probably a second cousin to John Brown. So John Brown had a lot of different people in these communities that he either knew or was related to. Reverend Moses Kimball Cross is another interesting person that we're going to talk about a bit more. Wells Spicer. Does anybody know who Wells Spicer was?
Map maker.
Yeah, he was a map maker. He was also involved in a number of other things once he went further west, including apparently he, if I remember correctly, I think, wasn't he the judge that was involved in settling the OK Corral eventually once he moved west? I think that might be, I may be wrong on that, but I think that's the case. Here's a picture of Aaron Humphrey's farmstead. This is gone. It's no longer around, but this is a very important place. Oh, we're there. When do you want to break?
Right now?